Welcome to all of you. We haven't seen each other since the workshop, and I haven't seen you since the workshop this way. So today's session is about what I call the concert of personality, the introduction to personality systems interactions, or PSI theory. So I give you a brief overview of what I want to show you. First of all, why the concert of personality? Why did I choose this title? Then I will give a brief overview of, let's say, basic ideas of personality systems interactions theory, what it actually is, where it comes from. Then I would like to introduce an action psychological approach to personality, whatever it means, you will see later. I will talk about action control and self-growth as two meta processes of human functioning, and arguing that, well, actually, everything's about action control and self-growth. I will introduce into four cognitive macro systems as the cognitive systems postulated by PSI theory, and afterwards how these systems, which we could call cognitive personality systems because they're very important for defining personality, how they interact to produce behavior and experience. I will close by touching at least the relevance of PSI theory in psychopathology. So how can we see conceptual psychopathology from a PSI perspective? So last year, we published in the European Journal of Personality a paper on personality systems interactions theory, which we call the concert of personality. And this is a little bit concentrated on how we could understand personality coherence and what it could mean. So typically in psychology, the term coherence or personality coherence has been used already by Allport in the 30s to express how different elements of personality work together, create a pattern, cohere together to produce behavior and experience. So we thought, because this was kind of a call from the journal, that this fits nicely what PSI theory has always been talking about. Let me start with an early citation of Julius Kuhl, my former PhD supervisor, a citation that he gave in a contribution to International Perspectives on Psychological Science in 1992, almost about 30 years ago. And this says, the theoretical challenge is to overcome seemingly contradictory paradigms. In recent years, there have been few attempts to integrate the various models into coherent theoretical basis. The concert of motivational psychology sounded much better in the past than it sounds today. Today, we sometimes hear disharmonies without a coherent theme. Some instruments seem to strum, plunk, and twang without their players seeming to care about what other players do. So basically, he refers to that personality and motivational psychology was much more theoretical. They had a theoretical concept before. But during the last decades, already at this time, it was much about empirical psychology. So thousands of papers came up to have a finding on how A relates to B, but there was not a broad conceptual basis that providing hypotheses about how these relationships come up. Let's continue. Our attempts at developing a framework for a functional interpretation of motivational phenomena were meant as efforts to reduce some of the confusion. Despite the variety of seemingly unrelated phenomena studied in motivational psychology, my concluding evaluation concerning the state of the art in this field is optimistic. Do I prefer disharmonies, uncoordinated strumming and twanging to a good concert? Of course not. I think we have just been listening to the tuning of the instruments. A new concert is about to start. So during the next years, he concentrated on developing a meta theory of personality and motivation. So he conceptualized personality as something dynamic, and motivation and cognitive processes and affect play a strong role by the way and the individual way they interact together to produce behavior as kind of a definition of personality. So PSI theory constitutes an integration of theories and empirical findings, which means most aspects of this theory are not new. They're taken from other theories, but the way they are composed together is specific to personality systems interactions theory, plus some specific assumptions about how affect modulates the connections between cognitive systems is something new. It roots in the psychology of motivation and volition. So this theory comes from a different field of psychology, moving into personality psychology, which at this time was almost exclusively dedicated to describe personality by a few factors, and debating about whether there are 5 factors or only 4 or 6 factors. And this was much about what the literature was. So this is a dynamic, process-oriented approach that wants to explain the mechanisms lying behind personality rather than to just describe personality in a static way. So personality is to some degree static, but we know, for example, let's take the trait of extroversion, whatever it is. Sometimes people feel extroverted in one and behave extroverted in one situation, but behave introverted in another. So the challenge of personality psychology is actually to explain why this is the case, and not just saying, okay, I have a score of extroversion of 7. It doesn't say much. It doesn't say much in which situations I behave like this or that. PSI theory can be considered a specific so-called dynamics of personality approach, or DPA approach. So this means that 3 years ago, with many personality psychologists over this globe, we summarized all process-oriented dynamic approaches toward personality under the name of the dynamics of personality approach, to give it some kind of strength. So together with colleagues who are very strong in this field, to make a point for an explanatory causal approach towards personality. And this approach highlights a couple of aspects which are fulfilled by PSI theory. And PSI theory was actually one of the first dynamics of modern dynamics of personality approaches. So this dynamics of personality approach considers the variability of experience and behavior over time. So within the same individual, we look over time and context rather than just look what differentiates between individuals. We may also call this people enter different personality states, as William Fleason came up with this notion to be provocative, because people were just talking about personality traits, but he was saying, oh, well, you can enter different states. Sometimes you're more extroverted, you're more introverted. The dynamics of personality approach investigates the network of interacting process variables. I already mentioned this word. Process variables means that we look into the variability of values of a certain variable over time. So not just between participants. Between participants would be, okay, one guy has a score of extroversion of 1 and the other guy has an extroversion score of 5. It's between. This is within participants. So how comes one state to the next? And not only do we investigate, for example, a relationship between two variables, we look at the network of an entire network of many variables, how they interact together, because we think in a systems theoretical cybernetic way, which means that there are many players to create the concert. There are many variables that produce a certain outcome. And if you neglect certain important variables, what you find could be far from reality. And these process variables relate to affective motivational variables, cognitive, volitional, but also other variables, as we will see later. Traits derive from specific processes rather than from aggregative factor analysis. Factor analysis is a very dominant approach, or it was very dominant over decades to define personality. So what researchers did here was to, without any theory, just take many statements or describing adjectives that describe humans and try to find common variants, so-called covariants among these items. So when one person says, well, I'm assertive, and this is the likelihood is very high, which means it's highly correlated with the statement, I'm a happy person. Factor analysis, when there's a whole covariation, aggregates different process variables to one big factor, for example, called extraversion. And this led to big debates about what extraversion actually is. So neuroscientists said extraversion, it's much about activity and has to do with the brainstem. Other neurobiologists said, well, it's about the sensitivity of the emotional system, the limbic system. These are different processes, and assertion versus non-assertion is something else even. But factor analysis without theory says, oh, well, they are all highly correlated, so let's put them together, and the researcher gives them a name which can be extraversion. That's the descriptive factor analytic approach, but all dynamics of personality approaches are different because they want to explain the mechanisms lying behind personality, and even explaining why these different heterogeneous variables have such a high correlation that factor analysis defines them as one factor. Okay, let's get back to the concert of personality, the instruments and sounds that we hear, and asking the question, what actually is personality? I gave you some hints already because I said, well, there are process variables, affective variables, cognitive variables that all interact together, but there are even more. So in PSI theory, 7 levels of processes have been defined. And this way, personality could be defined as the individual pattern of how basic cognition, temperament, affect, coping with stress, motives, complex cognition like thinking, and self-management processes interact to produce behavior and experience. So a number of process variables, how they interact to produce behavior and experience, and how individuals differ in these kind of interactions, which makes up the variance between participants or people. So let's stick to the metaphor of the concert. What could be the instruments or the player of the instruments? This could be the systems. And the sounds produced by these instruments could be personality processes. So processes derived from neurobiological systems or psychological systems that can be active or non-active. Let's come to the important question, why do we actually need personality? And I ask these questions to argue for such a process-oriented approach toward personality, or more specifically to argue for an action psychological approach to personality. When we ask the question, why do we need something, we have to look into, oh, well, Did I skip this one? No, probably comes later. So let's have first a look at the different levels of personality and their processes. I said there are 7 levels. I already introduced them in the last talk, but so let me just give you a brief overview. There is basic cognition. We can debate if this is actually cognition or not. To give it another term, I'm fine with this. So there is focused attention or focused perception versus context processing or even habits made out of these basic cognitive processes. There's temperament, which is made up of activation and arousal. Let me just take prototypical, very prominent processes. There are definitely more processes. There is affect and incentive motivation. So basic affects and appetition, aversion, desires, punishment, and reinforcement. There's coping with stress. You can cope in different kinds, like defensive or integrative or in a progressive or regressive way. I will not go into depth here because it would lead us away from the talk. Motives like for relationship, power, autonomy, achievement, or complex cognition, such as goals, analytical and holistical thoughts. You may also call it the intellect. And finally, self-management, self-regulation, a moderate form of managing yourself, or self-control or self-discipline, a more earnest, strict way of being strict to yourself. And you may also call self-management will. And as we will see, these could be 2 kinds of will. And all these 7 levels interact together in a certain way, or more specifically, the processes of these levels interact in a certain way to produce behavior and experience. And the amount of each level's contribution to determining behavior and experience varies within and between individuals. Sometimes we are better in self-management and self-regulation, and at other times there are our strivings which have a dominant control of our behavior. This is within one individual over time. And also people differ in these processes among each other. Yeah. So one person is more self-controlled, the other less. One has strong temperament, others have less temperament, are more melancholic or introverted, or how you want to call it. So I touched this question before, and then I had this slide coming in between. The function of personality. Let's take an action psychological perspective and a combination with an evolutionary perspective. So when you think of what actually makes up evolutionary success, survival and reproduction, it's basically not internal processes. Finally, evolutionary success is measured, is read by action. We reproduce, we fight, we leave a dangerous situation by action. And all the internal processes that we have seen before, temperament, sensitivity to affect, affective processes, and so on, thinking, what we do as psychologists and philosophers, are subsidiary. They help to produce some action here or there. This is why, from an evolutionary perspective, thinking has been developed, because there are problems in action. We cannot immediately act, so let's think about it first and to derive some action. Okay, so personality can be seen from such a perspective as the social biological attempt to optimally adapt to the environment and thus to be evolutionary success. So we have genetic inheritances with respect to personality. They give us a global direction for a certain environment. So we are adapted as, I don't know, my family to a certain environment. And there is a slow adaptation. And we have the social cultural inheritance. So what we learn from the parents and the interaction from the parents, this is more specific to the needs of the child in this certain family surroundings. And it guarantees a fast adaptation, what is actually happening. Now, the action psychological approach was just mentioned. Evolutionary success is made by action primarily and only secondarily by internal processes. Thus, personality functions to optimize self-management. And when I say self-management, some people use the term self-regulation or just how to get to your goals, how to achieve your goals. You can call it self-management. It's also used nowadays very often. A dynamic action psychological approach may thus be appropriate to conceptualize personality and explain personality traits rather than, for example, an atheoretical approach of factor analysis. So let's have a view on personality from action or phases that we need to run through to come to a certain action. So this is a model. There are different models out there. One prominent model is the so-called Rubicon model of action phases. This one is based on or an integration of a PSI model and the Rubicon model and some other models. So there is, first of all, a selection phase. So we'll select a certain choice. We make a decision and we get into a planning phase. So we need to plan for the action. If we have planned, we enter the action phase. We take initiate instead of procrastinate. And then we stop the action and make an evaluation, what was good, what was bad, and we integrate it into a memory system which serves as a basic for later selections, for good selections to be made later. So one assumption is that specific cognitive processes or functions play a central role in these phases, but they are not exclusive, which means they can also play a role in others, but some processes are very dominant in certain phases. So let's start on the upper right, selection phase. There is the adaptive function of associative processing. So we only by having a broad overview, so processing associatively, we can get a good overview of our preferences, of contexts, variables, in order to feed our decision. We need to look into ourselves, into our feelings, into reception and autobiographical memories. So we need to have a holistic, broad associative overview. We make a decision, and in the planning phase, we need some analytical thought, and we need to prioritize goals. In the action phase, we need much of sensory motor control to coordinate the stimuli with the motor processes. In the evaluation phase, we check what went wrong. So we have a system that uses error detection. What went wrong? Yeah. And so on and so on. And as I mentioned already before, the term of personality states can be used to describe what happens in these phases. So personality states can be considered processing modes that we enter during self-regulation or self-management phases to optimize action to finally satisfy our needs and reach our goals. So coming from this perspective, what are personality traits? In this way, personality traits are tendencies to engage or even linger in certain states or phases and their processes. And these traits could be in the selection phase, for example, openness to experience, or what we call self-access, having access to self-representations such as own preferences, autobiographical memories, emotions, and so on. In the planning phase, so there's much about industriousness and self-discipline, orderliness, industriousness as a facet of conscientiousness, for example. In the action phase, it's extroversion. Extroverted people are always very powerful and lots of energy. And the evaluation phase, there's much of neuroticism and orderliness. So we critically look at things that went wrong, typical for people who are kind of neurotic and orderly. So as I mentioned before in the overview, there are two meta processes, which is much behavior about. It's action control and self-growth. Action control and self-growth, what is it? Action control is about how to reach your goals, how to adapt your actions to achieve certain goals. And self-growth is basically about how to grow from new experiences that we have not made before, even painful experiences. And in such a self-management cycle, action control would be on the left side. So we have a planning phase and where we keep intentions. And the question is, how do we implement them into actions? And self-growth is more about the right side. It's about evaluating novelties or errors and integrating them in a large memory system that we later use to make good decisions in our life. And this is what we can call the self-growths. Again, when we take an action psychological perspective, self-growth is basically subordinate to action control as it serves the optimization of future actions. Now, a very basic assumption in personality systems interactions theory is that these processes, which are adaptive during certain phases, derive from personality systems that are somewhere located in the brain. Just like the sounds stem from instruments, processes from systems. In order to be adaptive in these phases, these systems need to be active. So this theory is about activating systems or deactivating systems. And you can easily imagine that when people have difficulties activating a certain system or deactivating another system, they may have impairments in certain phases. So somebody in the planning phase may overthink, constantly think and will never get a publication done as a scientist, for example. Yeah. May think and will not get into action. Yeah. Somebody who's constantly in an action phase and cannot deactivate it may not get into a planning phase. Things like that. Yeah. The neurotic person may be constantly in an evaluation phase, get stuck and starting ruminating. Yeah. So the systems that underlie these phases, as I said, they can also or are necessary in other phases too, but here they play a very dominant role. In the selection phase, it's the so-called integrative self. So this large, broad, holistically processing memory, including autobiographical memories, that you can activate to get an overview of many possibilities that you have, context factors, and so on. In the planning phase, we need the so-called intention memory to keep intentions in mind upon a situation comes which is beneficial to exert our action, because we cannot constantly act. Sometimes we have other goals as well, so we need to postpone them, or keep back our needs for the toilet or whatever. So the intuitive behavior system is the one which is necessary for the action phase. And in the evaluation phase, it's the object recognition system. In other publications, we call it the error focus or error system, because it's much about detecting errors. These different systems can be conceptualized as large-scale cognitive brain networks. Large-scale cognitive brain networks means that they are spread all over the brain, and still they have some connectivity and work together to produce certain processes. Let me get a little bit deeper into the 4 systems. So there's intention memory. Let's start with this one, because probably it's the one most prominent in philosophy and psychology, because at least Western philosophy and psychology, because we already often highlight goals and planning and thought, analytical thought. To start with a metaphorical illustration, let's think of this black-dressed nerd with his computer sitting at home and basically a little bit lazy to get into motoric actions. It's a stereotype, but believe me, there are many. It's a typical pattern of nerds, although not for all of them. So, but you can see which works for such a person or not, or maybe even yourself or so on. So intention memory has the function to keep intentions for concrete actions active in memory. It has a strong goal focus. And there is a subsidiary system, which is analytical thought. Analytical thought is an explicit system. It thinks in either or logics. It creates rules for categorization, and it is kind of decoupled from emotions. So when we are strictly logically thinking, this is sometimes even used to downregulate emotions, when we get into this rational system. And it basically cannot complete fragmented information. It needs all information to make a conclusion, other than the contrasting system to which we come right now. And in the brain, there are many areas. Just to highlight 2, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is known for analytical thought, and the Brodmann area 10 is known for keeping intentions in mind. The integrative self, as I already mentioned, in the Western philosophies and psychologies, it has long been neglected. As an illustration, let's take a man or a woman sitting relaxedly at a table and just having the overview of everything, like a Buddha. So the function of the integrative self is to have a mental overview of self-relevant contexts, everything that is self-relevant to me. And this can also be, maybe I have a strong value in being moral, then it also belongs to me that I have an overview of other people's belongings. So these could be preferences, values, experiential self-representations, and as I just said, representations of others. The subsidiary system is holistic thought. So we can use holistic thought without any self-representations, such as, for example, when you have to solve a mathematical task, like in a text, given in a text. So you need to have kind of an overview of everything like that. But it's not self-referential. But still, this broad overview can be seen as a subsidiary system for the integrative self, because to make good decisions, we need to have an overview of many aspects. So to describe this system, we could say it is holistic wholly semantic, so it can it works with metaphors and remote associations. So as a basis for creativity, it is parallel processing. It can complete fragments from an lack of information. So it's just completing it by associative processing. It works on the preconscious level. So because we cannot have all these information in focused attention, it's too much. So it must be preconscious, actually. It is sensitive to context, which is related to the parallel processing of contexts. And it is necessary to make meaning. Yeah, we need to have a broad overview to connect it to many values and preferences that we have. And this is kind of meaning making. When we are too analytical, we cannot get many aspects together that make a big picture out of the world and what is important to us. It integrates self-representations, positive with negative self-representation. So when we ever are in a negative state, the self helps to make connections with positive aspects in order to get out of a ruminative negative tunnel vision. It has a congruence focus, which can be derived from parallel processing mechanisms, that it looks at similarities with other people, similarities, what fits to me as a person, rather than what is different from me. Yeah, it has a congruence rather than a error focus. And it is connected with emotions. So the areas in the brain which provide these broad overviews and self-referential representation have strong connections to the limbic system, other than the poor ratio. And there are, for example, the right medial prefrontal cortex, which is much about self-representations, integrated self-representations, and holistic thought, for example, frontotemporal regions. Object recognition system. So as I said, the one which focuses on discrepancies and errors. Well, a person, who's has a strong object recognition has tendencies towards obsessive compulsiveness, even being pedantic, looking at things that do not fit here or there, to discrepancies, like this sweet lady who is taking some stuff, some nuts or whatever from the roof of a camping wagon or whatever. Just to mention again, this is a process approach, which means that it's not about, or not exclusively about, personality traits. Although this woman might have an obsessive compulsive trait or a strong object recognition system, she may just be in such a state right now. And in another state, she may switch to another system's activation. And as you can easily see, the better you can switch between systems and self-regulation phases, the easier it is for you to get along in your life. And the more fixated you are on a certain system, the more it goes into psychopathology. So this is just a preview of what I will show at the end. So the object recognition system has the function of detecting errors and discrepancies. And it focuses on these errors, and it has a local attention. It is consciousness, or whenever we detect errors, we get a conscious awareness of these stimuli or details. It categorizes, which means that it compares novelties and whatever we see in the world with categories and schemas. And only this way we can say, okay, there's an error or not. It extracts details from the context. It's past oriented because of this schemata that we have. Oh, it must be like this and that because it has always been like this and that. And but this is something new. It's a discrepancy. So it has kind of a past orientation. Now, I just mentioned depression or obsessive compulsiveness. It has to do with some orientedness towards the past. And a decontextualized. So people with a strong object recognition system, or when you are in a mode of object recognition, it's difficult for you to process context because you concentrate, you focus on one particular detail and only see this. You don't see the forest anymore. You only see the trees, or one tree actually. In the brain, it is much about the left occipital parietal cortex, which has been found to be active in local processing, or the ventral visual path, which comes from the occipital parietal and goes down the temporal lobes. The intuitive behavior control, as I said, is important for sensor-motory coordination, sensory motor coordination. So we need it in sports, in movements, and so on. When you're constantly in this one, well, you are active doing all kinds of activities. The function is sensory motor coordination, and it works on an automatic, non-conscious level. So we are kind of primed. Our behavior is primed by certain stimuli and we just function. This is necessary to have a good coordination. And this is why sensory motor control here, sensors or stimuli and motoric responses are kind of fused in the brain. So which guarantees for immediate adaptation to what we see in the spatial world. So it's much about context and peripheral perception. We need to see everything and move in a very intuitive way. So this is why it's called intuitive behavior control, and or even automatic way. This system is in the here and now, because we do all these orientations and movements right now. It's not in the past, but the stimuli are right now here. It's much about emotional contagion and social synchronization or mimicry, because the motor system, which is involved here, includes mirror neurons, so that we can quickly adapt to other people's faces and other nonverbal communications. In the brain, it's about motor areas and premotor areas, as I said, including mirror neurons, the cerebellum, and many more brain parts. Okay, let's get back to the overview of the four systems and how they interact together. First of all, the systems or some of the systems show mutual inhibitions. But these inhibitions can also be disinhibited. So you can release these inhibitions. The idea of inhibitions comes from neuroscientific theories about contra and ipsilateral inhibitions in the brain. That when, for example, the corpus callosum, which provides these inhibitions, when you have a strong left frontal activation, the right frontal tends to be inhibited. But also from logical reflections, not only from these empirical findings, because, as I already said, when do we need intention memory, including analytical thought? Whenever there is a problem, whenever you cannot immediately act, whenever you cannot immediately get to your food, to your partner, to your mom, to whatever, you need to think about how to do that. Now, there are other possibilities too. You can get aggressive, or ask for help, which are very basic coping strategies which mammals use. We do use them as well, and children. But what is kind of specific to humans or humanoids is that we think. We use the thinking apparatus to solve problems because we cannot immediately get to something that we want to. So there needs to be an inhibition between the two systems, because otherwise, when there is a problem and intention memory is active to keep this intention, or first start planning about something, keep this intention in mind, it would be bad to immediately act because the situation is not appropriate to act. So intuitive behavior control is inhibited by thinking. Even our mimic is kind of very different when we think. It's kind of a frustrated or anger mimic. And intuitive behavior control, it's more positive, which already suggests that affects are relevant here too, which we will see later. So disinhibiting this connection is about action control. Well, it's already action control when we inhibit intuitive behavior control and start thinking first. What I want to say is action control is about the left side of this model. On the right side, there is an inhibition too. Whenever our self, it's actually mutual inhibition, whenever our self, which provides a broad overview of things, is active, detailed processing of errors cannot be active at the very same time, because broad processing and local processing are kind of exclusive. Disinhibiting this connection is about self-growth, which means that object recognition is necessary to detect novelties. What is different from our scheme, from our known scheme, so we can learn. So we have to focus on this, and then we have to compare it with what we know with our experience system, let's call the integrative self. So disinhibiting this connection is about integration and learning, and our self can grow. There is also an inhibitory connection between intention memory and integrative self. You may remember my talk from the workshop, which was about the ego and the self. So you could call the intention memory, at least in combination with the object recognition, the ego, the integrative self, well, the self. And people who are very rational, having lots of goals in their mind, they typically tend to not be in, focus on their emotions and having an overview because they're so goal-oriented. Somebody who has a broad overview of the internal world of preferences and values and so on is not in the goal modus. But a quick switching between the systems can guarantee for an optimal self-management and reaching your goals. But some people have a hard time switching. They kind of are stuck in a system and cannot overcome the inhibition. And if this is an extreme case, we call it a psychopathology. Now, I already mentioned that affects play a role in connecting these different cognitive systems. First of all, there's positive affect. So let's start with the case of inhibited or a lack of positive affect, which we might call frustration. So positive affect becomes reduced whenever we cannot reach a goal by our action, which means there is a problem. We need to activate the planning, thinking, intention system, to plan and how to better get at what we want to get. So this comes with reduced positive affect. And now, as I said, we can already see it in the face. People thinkers are like this. And then when you go for it, you're much more happy. So the question is how to get into the action mode again by upregulating positive affect. And this is expressed here by the dotted line. Positive affect disinhibits the inhibitory connection. So minus and minus is plus, let's call it this way. And information can flow from intention memory to intuitive behavior control. So the two systems are interacting with each other. So this is about action control. We could also call it the facilitation of the will. That's a weird word, but sometimes you need weird words to make explanations for something that we haven't seen yet. There is the word behavioral facilitation, but we cannot use this because behavioral facilitation is just facilitating behavior. This can be impulsive. You may not have thought enough about how to act, and people make mistakes in tasks when they have a behavioral facilitation. When just the intuitive behavior control becomes active, they act impulsively. But we need the interaction between intention memory, which means there is something difficult going on and we need to solve it. And now we need to switch back. And in order to activate positive affect from, let's say, a mindset, a current mode of processing of, oh, there are difficulties and I need to reflect about it and so on. This needs will. Or we could say, yeah, will becomes activated by positive affect or facilitated. This doesn't mean that will can come from somewhere else too, but positive affect helps to bring us into behavior. We will learn about two forms of will later, or self-management or self-regulation. Okay, anyway, on the right side, self-growth is much about negative affect or regulating down negative affect, because negative affect, as many studies show, it increases a local focused attention, object recognition. We look at details in the negative mode, at potential discrepancies, because discrepancies are potential threats. They are new. We do not know what's going on. Yeah, is it something dangerous? Yeah, this is what negative affect does. At least fear. Don't know about all negative affects, and this is what still has to be researched on. But negative affect as fear, for example. So this inhibits the connection between integrative self and object recognition, which means immediately we are in the object recognition, and the influence, the dampening influence of integrative self on object recognition is reduced. So now for self-growth, we need a second process too. Just as in action control, first thinking, then behaving, then acting. Here, first looking at the discrepancies, at the novelties, rather than to just repressing them and do not open our eyes. Look at them, process them, and integrate them. And this is helped by reducing negative affect, in other words, to become relaxed. As long as negative affect is active, we are more in the detailed discrepancy focus, but by relaxing ourselves, we get into the integrative self. You may think of meditation practices, mindfulness, and so on, which is much, or maybe even exclusively about this. So the inhibition of this already existing inhibition between integrative self and object recognition by negative affect may be called self-inhibition. We are not with ourselves. We are in the outside world of dangerous things, potential dangerous things and discrepancies. So our self is inhibited. Also, just by the way, positive affect and negative affect are typically inhibited at the same time. So you may also recognize or think back of the 7 levels. So this core of personality systems interactions theory is basically about 3. How 3 levels interact. Basic cognition is about intuitive behavior control and object recognition, which all animals have. The upper level, level 7, is about volition. It's about intention memory, integrative self. So it has much to do with self-management, but also analytical thought and holistical thinking. So when we take the 6th level, it's kind of included in this graph, at least. And level 3, affect, is here to modulate the cognitive systems. The other systems play a role too, but there are not too many experiments about that, how they exactly are involved here. Okay, before I already mentioned that the will or self-management could be divided in 2 types of will. One is called self-regulation. And at the same time, self-regulation is much about authenticity. Why is this the case? This is the case because the integrative self, which is about ourselves, our deepest desires and preferences, belongings and values that we created through our lives, our autobiographical memory, because this system plays a strong role basically for the coordination of all systems. So let me redo what I said before, that the integrative self plays a dominant role in the selection phase. I already mentioned it's not exclusive. This system, particularly this system, is crucial in the entire self-management process and plays basically a role here and there and everywhere. So let's get a little bit more concrete with respect to this. Self-regulation can be considered the collective of self-management processes that are based on self-access. So the engagement of the integrative self, which we call self-access. When we have access to our preferences, at the very moment, we can say we can access the integrative self. Some other people, or in some moments, you may have a blockage or a self-inhibition. But when you have accessibility to it, it's kind of active. So self-regulation takes the energy from our own preferences and values, which are very positive. And this gives us energy for the entire self-management process. So it's effortless. We do not need much discipline. It's intuitive, because our self in the background of our mind, I said it's pre-conscious or subconscious, guides our behavior in a more intuitive way. So we do not need to plan much. The thinking system is on the left side. And this is basically what is meant by authenticity, because we behave the way, we think the way, congruent with ourselves. By contrast, we could, for example, make just plans derived from what other people tell us, from social expectations, activate intention memory immediately, without checking whether what somebody else said, what we should do, is congruent with the contents of the integrative self, such as own preferences or values. So let's get into different self-regulation functions or processes. So as I said, the 2 systems are kind of inhibited, but here too we can disinhibit this. And this is exactly the case when the self is active and transfers information to the intention memory. So this means that our decisions are made based on self-representations, preferences, emotions, and so on. This is the self-decision. Self-insight can also be assigned to this location, because when we inhibit intention memory, or when we have a good exchange between the two, only then we can have self-insight. Because in planning system thinking on the left side without checking back to our emotions creates a false picture, a false self-concept. So we think in a way about ourselves how we are not. But when we constantly check with our preferences, we can create a self-concept which is authentic. And this is self-insight. It's about an interaction between integrative self and intention memory. Self-motivation, or we could say self-determined motivation, is about the influence of the integrative self on action control. By which way? It activates, it provides the positive affect in a way that intentions can more easily be implemented into action. Because, well, we could get positive affect from somewhere else, watching a movie or whatever. But self-motivation is the type of generating positive affect that comes from own preferences, own values, motives, self-representations, and so on. And this is basically, let's say, the more mechanistic interpretation of self-determination. Yeah? That, or intrinsic motivation, if you want so. It's not exactly the same. It's basically more about integrated motivation or integrated regulation. Self-relaxation is the case when negative affect is, for example, not just reduced by your mother or by your partner, who can take you in the arms. It's provided by your own self, by memories, integrated memories of, that you have managed something already before, or that, well, if you do not achieve a certain goal in a certain way, think of what positive aspects it could still have to maybe not have reached this goal. So maybe you have more free time and which you can spend with your family. Yeah. So this can only be done by the integrative self, because it provides an overview in a broad, holistic way of many possibilities and interpretations of a certain situation. So the integrative self can reappraise, it can accept a certain situation, so we do not become obsessive like the intention memory. Each system has kind of a inertia function. So each system is kind of trying to continue its own game, but it's only inhibited by other systems. So when you are obsessively following a goal and this is what you want to reach, finally will end up with only seeing things negative, only seeing errors. But by inhibiting the object recognition system, you can broadly process and see something positive in the non-achievement of the goals, and this relaxes your negative affect. So I said self-regulation is the collective of self-management process based on accessibility of the self. So this is a very effortless, intuitive, preconscious, authentic form of will. It just comes by itself, and it's quite easygoing. On the other hand, there's self-control or self-discipline, which we basically only need when we do not have access to the self. So when it doesn't come by itself, then we need to put much effort, deliberate effort, to reach our goal. So whenever there's no self-motivation, so this one arrow we see in the middle, we need self-discipline to put our intentions into action. Well, and this is effortful. And when we continuously do it like this, we may end up in a burnout or a depression when it doesn't come by ourselves. As you may see, there are so many philosophical theories which have such ideas, and PSI theory tries to provide a neuropsychological mechanistic basis of interactions, of inhibiting and facilitating excitatory connections of how this actually works on such a, let's say, brain basis or cybernetic basis, systems basis. Okay, let's come back to the concert. As I said in the beginning, whenever the notion of concert is used in personality psychology, it's often used in context of coherencies. So their coherencies in a neurobiological way, for example, means that different brain areas are activated at the same time in a way that they communicate with each other. That's coherence in neuroscience. It's similar here. When two systems cohere, so they have an information exchange. As I said, let's start with self-decision. I said, or building self-insight. It's about exchange between the rational thought and checking back with your emotions and introspection. Yeah. And so they need some flow of information, which can only be gathered when at least in 1 millisecond or so, the two systems are active at the same time. So this is about systems coherences between or among systems. But let's start with self-coherence. This is a coherence within one system, or at least within one macro system. There can be subsystems of information and which cohere. Self-coherence means that the many self aspects are integrated with each other. Disintegration would be when, let's say, your picture of being a good child conflicts with the idea of being a rebel. Yeah, you cannot integrate it, and you're at one time you're like this, another like this, and you feel ashamed when somebody sees you as a rebel. Your father sees you doing some bad stuff. Yeah, but self-coherence means that you are okay with these seeming incompatibilities. So the different notions of yourself, representations, are highly interconnected. Also in a way that when you activate one representation, it easily activates another representation, as for example, a prerequisite for turning negative representations into positive things. Self-growth is about strengthening of self-coherence. Yeah, novelties, you integrate them in the already large database integrated self. Yeah, you integrate more and more, so self-coherence increases. So our project, for example, is called personality growth, and we've thought about personality growth. Is it the same like self-growth? Well, it's not the same when we think of the self as one subsystem of personality. Some traditions might use it interchangeably, the self and personality. It's all about me, just self-personality. No, but this is not the case in personality theory. There, the self, the integrated self, to be more precise, is a subsystem of personality. The whole is personality. So personality growth is more. It's the superordinate term that integrates self-growth, and that refers to all kinds of coherences among systems. And this is basically what also Carl Rogers, the originator of client-centered therapy, meant by fully functioning person. Such a person can do everything. It's very planful. It has strong connections to their emotions. It easily detects failures and errors, but it can also integrate them and make something out of it, and so on. It's fully functioning, and we could say you can easily switch between the systems depending on the context and what is necessary. So here are some coherences. Intention behavior coherence. There is was a long debate in psychology about the intention behavior gap. Yeah. So when you have certain intentions at New Year's Eve, why will you not simply exert them? We have strong intentions. Maybe positive affect is lacking. Maybe other things. So intention behavior coherence means the optimal exchange between these two systems in order to get into action. Self-intention coherence means the exchange between intention memory and integrative self to provide strong decisions made by own preferences and values, and to get insights into yourself and build up a true, authentic self-concept. Perception self-coherence. Well, the novelties that you see, that you do not simply repress when you have, for example, a certain concept of the world or yourself, but that you recognize it and that you improve the version of yourself. Because of all these discrepancies that you realize, you may get to the idea that your self-concept is wrong. Maybe you have here or there some weaknesses, so you have to focus on them and then integrate them rather than to just repress and forget them. So this is perception self-coherence when you do not do it like this, but when you develop yourself. So it's also about self-growth when there's strong connection between these two systems. Nevertheless, self-growth is key to personality growth, which highlights the action psychological rationale, saying that it's all about action. We grow, and the more we grow, the higher the likelihood that we have good actions, that we make good decisions for actions. And this is compatible with what Carl Rogers means when he says that a fully functioning person is in touch with innermost feelings and desires. As you can see, self-growth strengthens the integrative self, and it has a strong role for many other processes too here. So the integrative self plays a real crucial role in PSI theory. So let's come to the last slide, personality systems, interactions, and psychological disorders. I will not go in depth here, but just touch some ideas. So how could psychological disorders be conceptualized? And I already mentioned this. An extreme dominance or sensitivity of a specific system makes prone to a certain psychological disorder. For example, when there is object recognition, I already mentioned obsessive compulsiveness, be categorizing and constantly looking at errors and trying to get rid of discrepancies between two pencils when they're not aligned and things like that. So the more extremely it is sensitive, which means that the more readily it is active whenever in a certain situation, the more you have a certain disorder. However, sometimes you can just say, well, you have kind of an extreme personality, but it's not a clinical case yet because we all have our weaknesses. And in German we say unsere Ecken und Kanten. So we're not around, but it's edgy here and there. This doesn't mean that it needs to be clinical, and this is why why I write here: extreme sensitivities combined with impaired emotion regulations, or in general the regulation of a system. So when you might have a tendency toward obsessive compulsives or a strong object recognition, the better you can downregulate negative affect, as I showed before, the better you get, the more you get relaxed and can activate the integrative selves and get off of this tunnel vision, rumination, or object focus. So the better your emotion regulation is, the better you can regulate the switching between the systems. So PSI theory, basically, it's a very core assumption that personality is much about regulating systems, not only or even less than about the sensitivity of systems. And it helps to buffer against the development of psychological disorders. And this is what basically psychotherapists do. They help you deal with your edges and your weaknesses. They help to increase emotion regulation abilities by this or that way. When you reduce traumata, for example, your emotions become weaker as well, and you do not focus so much on certain details or dangers. So object recognition is much about trauma too, because it's constantly activated by the thought of the trauma. Okay, what about depression, for example? Depression may be thought of as a fixation on reduced positive affect and thinking. So the anhedonic case of depression, at least, but also having reduced self-access. So as I already said, it becomes very hard when you constantly need self-discipline to implement your intentions. But when it comes from your integrative self, it makes you happy because you like what you do. You act according to your preferences. And if you're constantly thinking about things but do not get into action, it's also typical for depression. So it's on the left side of this graph is much about depression. It's about regulating positive affect. Anxiety is more about the right side of the graph. It's a fixation on negative affect and object recognition, also with reduced self-access. Well, which makes sense, as I said. When the self is active, it provides relaxation because it downregulates negative affect. So in the integrative self, activating the integrative self, and thus increasing emotion regulation is crucial. And it's also a transdiagnostic mechanism. So all kinds of psychopathologies have deficiencies in emotion regulation. And it may be the case because they have reduced access to the self. But there are, in all kinds of systems, like Buddhists would say, the monkey brain, which is not controlled by your self. Okay, so let's come to a conclusion. Personality and self-management might be conceptualized on the basis of interacting psychological or personality systems, as a summary. These systems find their expression somewhere in the brain, in large-scale brain networks, as we know today. These systems have developed in evolution to serve certain functions, as they are important in certain self-management or action phases. PSI theory serves as a framework which is based on such an action psychological rationale on a process-oriented approach and the idea that there are systems behind these processes that interact to provide behavior and experience. But we see it more as an initial framework rather than a final theory. So which means that there may be more than 4 cognitive systems in order to give a better explanations than with the 4 cognitive systems plus all the other systems. So we may use subsystems and, well, we may also think about the role of basic emotions such as anger, fear, sadness. Do they play the same role for connecting the cognitive systems with each other? Yeah, so these are unsolved questions now. So this is why it's just the idea, a basic idea that systems interact among each other to produce behavior and experience. Well, it's not a new idea. Already Freud's model of the instances is such a systems approach. Anyway, yeah, that's what I just mentioned. We are still unclear about which specific emotions modulate cognitive systems interactions. We may change system interactions pathways or more feedback loops or whatever, or include more systems and so on. Yeah, we have written about what could be an appropriate methodology today, modern methodology to investigate personality on the basis of such a systems approach. And using only big data with participants and using self-reports to correlate different elements or facets or domains of personality with each other is not enough. Much more, we need the neurosciences in order to establish what is actually a system by seeing in the brain where we have certain activations and what inhibits, disinhibits other systems. We come closer to the idea of which systems are necessary, what could be called a system, plus computational modeling in order to model the theory as a whole or parts of the theory and to see whether this, let's call it cognitive agent, or actually cognitive effective motivational volitional agent, acts like a healthy person, or what is wrong when the behavior looks like a person with a certain psychopathology. We can conclude yeah, from the implementation, the cognitive computation, how it comes from a healthy person to a certain psychological disorder. Okay, that was it. I want to thank my collaborating partners who contributed much to this research and conceptualizations, and my postdocs and PhD students who did so as well. Yeah, Farhud Malekzat, he looks a little bit strict, but you know him, he's not so strict. He's a very kind and happy person. Marius Jais, who just obtained his PhD from Technical University, and Gina Hernandez, who you all know very well already and takes the teaching part of our project. Okay, so I think we are done so far. Feel free to still collect questions about PSI theory or whatever we do here, and to make an extra session to discuss them. Feel just free to write.
Maybe I can add one more thing here. There's in German, I think there are two large interviews out by Manfred Hillmann, I think is his name, with Julius Kuhl, and the last one is on just recently on PSI theory and spirituality. Came out, I think, about 2 weeks ago on YouTube. It's if you simply Google PSI Theorie Spiritualität, and there's another one that's a bit older, maybe a year. PSI Theory, Selbstkompetenz der Selbstsorge, a long interview with Professor Julius Kuhl. But both of those are in German, but many of us do speak German. So the author is a guy named Manfred Hillmann, and he put those up on YouTube. But you'll find them easily.
Okay. Good comment. Thanks a lot, Godehard.